Thank you very much, Eli Weber, for inviting me this morning to speak with you. I'm very emotional because this yeshiva is the place where my brother, Zechariah Shlomo ben Yonah Miriam, left from when he went to war, Milchemet Shlom HaGalil, and did not return. From this very place, from this yeshiva, he left and did not return. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the story is not as simple as that. It's a story which spanned 37 years, and it certainly is very, very difficult to summarize in an hour a story that a family lived for 37 years, each one of them 365 days according to the Shnat HaChama, and 37 times 365 nights, when we did not know what, where, how, yes, no. Was he alive? Was he dead? Was he in prison? Was he captured? What was going on with him? Where was he? We didn't know that for 37 years. And I'm going to take you with me on a little journey, a story of how a family lives for 37 years under those circumstances. And also, at the end of 37 years, how you see the greatness of God in returning my brother to Eretz Yisrael, his beloved Eretz Yisrael, and so that we can have the big zchut of standing. Yesterday, I went with my son to Har Herzl, and we were able to be at his kever, and it was a great joy with tears, but there was a great joy that I was able to be in such a place. We didn't know that we would ever get there. So we have to go back to Bereshit. Everything starts with the Bereshit. And I took a little bit of inspiration from Kadosh Baruch Hu's writing when I was thinking about the speech, because Kadosh Baruch Hu, when he wrote the Chumash, first he wrote Sefer Bereshit. So that's the beginning. And then the event, the big event of the Tanakh is Sefer Shmot. And then you have just not dissimilar, of course it's different, but there was a long shtika, there was a long quiet from 2 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim until finally the 40th year. There's this empty space in the Chumash. What was going on? We don't know. We didn't know either. And then finally, we have our own personal Sefer Dvarim, which was the end of the story. So when I think of a structure of how to tell the story, I'm getting my inspiration from the greatest writer in the ever. So I'm going to start with Bereshit. And I'm going to tell you about Zechariah Shlomo, who is otherwise known to his friends and family as Zach. Zach was born in New York, in Brooklyn, to a family of extremely modern Orthodox traditional family. My grandfather and my great-grandfather, they learned in the Chasam Sofer Yeshiva, Pressburg Yeshiva in Hungary. They were very traditional. I received the Messiah with everything we did in the family was, what does the Mishnah Berurah say? What does the Mishnah Berurah say? We don't know. My father taught me at a very, very young age how to open the Mishnah Berurah and to find out what to do. And before I was born, I was told that my father used to call up Reb Moshe Feinstein on the phone and ask shaylas. This is a very traditional home. This is a home that received Masorah from the best of all sources possible, a very traditional home. And this will explain to you how we made it through the 37 years, because without that, I wouldn't be here. We never could have made it as a family without the tradition. On the other hand, on the other side, we were also very Zionistically oriented. My father, Alav Shalom, was a member of Bnei Akiva in New York. He used to go to the camps, and he was a madrich. And he went to Yeshiva Eitz Chaim in Borough Park at the time. It lasted for many years. I understand it's no longer there, but it was there for 2-3 generations. And Zach also went to Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. And it was a school where you learned ahavat haaretz, you learned the love of the land, where you learned half a day from the morning, from 8 o'clock in the morning. After tefillah, they would sit in the classrooms, and until 1, 2 o'clock, they would learn only limudei kodesh, but ivrit be'ivrit. We all came to Eretz Yisrael, we knew Hebrew. And only in the afternoon hours until 5, then they started social studies and math and whatever. And one of the biggest holidays in the year was Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is now. And we were very Zionistically oriented. And ever since I remember in New York, in America, we were talking about coming here, coming to Eretz Yisrael, making Aliyah. And there was one big thing that held us back, and that was the former generation. Now, both of my parents did not have their own parents alive at the time. They were both orphans when they married. So I didn't have grandparents that they had to stay for, but there were other members of the family, aunts, uncles, who were very, very focused on our family, who would come to our Seder every year. They were part of our life, and it was a very hard decision to uproot and leave these older people who were aging behind in New York. What changed that was the 6-Day War. When the 6-Day War broke out, the New York community was very, very, very stressed. They were very much in tune to what was going on in Eretz Yisrael. And when the victory came about, there was a euphoria which cannot be described. And the effect was that people who were thinking maybe to make Aliyah made the decision, it's the time. And at that time, my parents said, okay, we're just going to do it, and we'll have to find a solution for the elderly people. Ultimately, we did find solutions, okay? We did find solutions. We didn't just leave people behind. And I remember like yesterday, the sound of my father, Alav Shalom, on our front porch, a closed room, packing up the contents of a lifetime into boxes. The sound of the boxes being closed up, a lifetime being closed up into boxes, and the truck coming to put it onto a lift, and off it goes. And then we had the tickets, and we went on the airplane. And before I knew it, I was walking in Lod Airport. It wasn't Ben Gurion Airport at the time, because Ben Gurion was still alive. It was Lod Airport, and I'm breathing the rarefied air of Eretz Yisrael, and I'm seeing the first time in my life what a palm tree looks like. For me, the palm trees were a symbol of the Middle East. And Zach in New York was a typical 4th grade boy who collected baseball cards, Joe DiMaggio and Willie Mays. And he played baseball in the yard of Eitz Chaim Yeshiva after school, and he loved baseball. And he was a very average kind of kid, a very average kind of student. And we land in Israel, and of all the family, not only because he was youngest, but because in his mentality, he fit in immediately. He had absolutely no problems in absorption. There was no problem. They took him out of Eitz Chaim, they put him into Mamlachti Dati Kiryat Motzkin. They put him into an Israeli school. And it was like, he took immediately. It was totally successful, the transplant. And the only difference was that instead of baseball, now he was playing soccer. Within a few weeks, he was totally into soccer and basketball, and everything was beseder. Everything was fine. He was great. And he was still the average student that he was before. And he was oblivious to what was going on around him because it was not easy for my parents to make Aliyah. We made Aliyah in the 1970s. We came actually in 1970. And 1970 was a wonderful time to come to Eretz Israel because it's always a wonderful time to come to Eretz Israel. But the question is how many challenges you're going to face. And it was also a very challenging time because financially the country was not doing so great during those years. There was runaway inflation, jobs were very hard to get, and my parents had a hard time of it. They really did. But nobody ever complained. I don't remember any member of our family ever opening their mouth to say, why, it's not good, never. It wasn't there. It was not part of our speech. It was always everybody helping each other. What can we do to help each other? What can we do to make this work? And we did make it work. And part of making it work was that I was given partially responsibility on Zach because my parents both had to work very, very long hours. And I was 2 years older, so that's already an adult, right? So I was put in charge. So I would take him to school, and I'd make sure that, if he was hungry, and my mother wasn't around, or she was tired, or it was whatever, I was in charge. So the bond that I have with my brother, and I say have because it's inside of me, when someone leaves, they don't disappear, they just go inside of you. So the bond that I have with my brother is a very, very deep one, very caring one, bond of love. And the word love, I know it's very difficult to say it in the yeshiva, but I think it's the highest thing because we say, Avavta et Hashem Elokecha. It means a deep connection. It means caring. And this is a story of caring because we'll see that a lot of people developed their highest qualities of caring through the story. So I'm going to go further on. Zach went to Midrashiyat Noam. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's also passé, but in Pardes Chana, one of the leading educational institutions in the country at the time. He graduated, and ultimately he landed up in your Bet Midrash. He came here, and he did Hesder. And when Zach came to the Hesder program, it was not the way it is here now. And I'm really very, very emotional about seeing this program here with all the things that you're being done for you, because there was no overseas program at the time. There were no facilities for chutznikim. I'm not saying this from my observations. I'm saying it from what I've been told by your rabbeim. Okay, I would never say it from my own volition, but this is what your Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Moshe, told me, that there was no chutznik program at the time. There were no overseas facilities. There was nobody to greet the students who came from America, and students came from America, but there was no one to greet them in their own language. There was no program. There were no thoughts about maybe we have to treat them a little differently. We have to do something for them. And when these students came from America, Zach was there. And he had the advantage of speaking English and knowing the American culture. After all, he played baseball. What else do you need to know, right? And he had a language because we spoke English at home, not only the verbal language, but the cultural language, because I grew up in a culture that was both very, very, very Jewish and very, very American. So he became a one-man absorption program. And he used to sit with students from overseas and learn b'chevrusa. And I think that he was able to lift them up on the level of learning to a place where they felt more comfortable in the yeshiva. He was also able to speak to them and understand what problems they were going through. Again, it never hurts to hear how people who were before you had a harder time. The first boys who came from America, I shouldn't call you boys, you're young men. The first young men who came from America were shocked when there was no hot water 24 hours a day in the yeshiva. There was only hot water at certain hours, and I think it was the evening because Israelis need hot water in the evening, right? And if they wanted it in the morning and there was no hot water, they were shocked out of their minds. They may have come from Teaneck or from Washington or from I don't know where. But the idea that you only have hot water at certain hours was a little bit shocking. And then there was shmirah. You do a mitvach and you go do shmirah. And at night, when Zach was doing shmirah with the boys, they would have little schmoozes. They would have little talks. And they would ask him, what in the world is going on? You know, what are you doing here? What's your vision of your life here? Because they were going back, 100%. They were there for a year. It was a one-year program. And he said, this is my country, and I'm always coming back here, no matter, even if I go to Chutz La'aretz. It was a little bit prophetic. He says, I'm always coming back here. And it was as though God heard what he said and brought him back after he left us and went to war. The day of the Krav, the day of that war broke out. I'm going to move on to that. Just a little bit of water. Okay. June 1982. I think it would be right to say that the war, we call it Milchemet Shlom HaGalil, people knew that something was cooking. It wasn't a total surprise. There was an ambassador that was killed in Europe. There was tension in the north. For months, there were all sorts of unpleasant things falling over Kiryat Shmona and the other villages in the north. But when it broke out, it was, of course, a shock, a total shock to the community, especially to the parents and families of people who were in uniform. And Zach was here in Yeshiva when it broke out. Our last Shabbat that I spent with my brother was a week or two before, I'm not exactly sure. But we were home, the two of us, Shabbos afternoon. And as siblings will do, we were sitting in the living room while my parents were sleeping and having a little bit of a talk about theology. And I was a little bit of an Eiber Chacham at the time. So we were talking about how we understand Hashem, something very, very low-key. And Zach said to me at the time, I know since then, actually, Benjamin Netanyahu told me which philosopher coined the term that he used, that Zach used. But I had this little talk with Bibi about it. But he said to me, we don't understand God. Our existence in this world is similar to a fly sitting on the nose of a giant, and the fly has no perception of anything to do with the giant. All he feels is a little bit of skin underneath his feet. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that when he went to war, he went with emunah tmima. Very, 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 very emunah tmima. It was the same as my father. My father had this very, very emunah tmima. Even though he was quite a sophisticated individual, he was a college graduate. Zach never went to college, but I'm talking about my father. He was also very tamim. Everyone who knew him said that. And Zach was just the same. There was a certain kesher between my father and Zach because they were very, very similar in personalities. They had a tmimut. Emunah tmima. They didn't need all sorts of sibuchim. They didn't need to read the Rambam. They had a very simple faith, and I think that gives me a lot of strength when I think that he went to war with his simple faith in God. A bus pulled up in front of the yeshiva. Sent by Tzahal, and all the Hesder boys get into the bus from that Machzor, and off they go to the Lebanese front. The last picture I have of him, he's sitting in an area where the soldiers are gathered, and he's telling jokes. And you can see the smile on his face from ear to ear, because he had a huge, wonderful sense of humor. Everybody else is sitting there, chamur sever, and he's sitting there telling jokes. And from there, the next day, they got into the tanks, and they crossed the border, and off they went into Lebanon. I'm not a history teacher, but I'll give you Rega Shel Historia, a minute of history, just to give you an idea what this war was about. The war was basically to stop the constant bombardment of the northern area. Patzmarim, Katyushot, whatever, Margamot, whatever they had, they sent over. They should have wrapped it in gift wrapped with a ribbon. And people were living in the shelters. They didn't have a life. And so they had to attack Lebanon all along the coast and to clean out all the areas where there were terrorists. The area with Zach ultimately landed up in was controlled by Ahmed Jibril, Chazit Amamit L'Shichur Palestine, it's called. And there were different groups there, and they just wanted to do a whole clean out so that people in the north could sleep in their beds at night. There were 3 roads into Lebanon. There was along the coast, and there was in the center, and then there was in the east. It's very, very parallel to the geography of Eretz Israel, where you have Kvish HaChof, right? When you go from Tel Aviv to Haifa, and then there's the center, there's the Kvish Tulkarem, and then on the east you have the Kvish Habika. So imagine if you take the Kvish Habika that goes from Yericho, Yerushalayim, all the way up towards the Kinneret, right? Towards Beit Sha'an, and you just keep continuing. That same road exists straight up into Lebanon. Straight up into Lebanon, you can keep going. And it's into an area which they call in Lebanon, they call it Bak'ah, which means, very difficult to understand, Bik'ah, right? It's a flat area. And the road keeps going on. Now, their misima, their purpose was to go to an area on the Kvish Habika, which is called Meshulash Tovelno, in which there are 3 roads, Meshulash 3 roads that meet at one place in the shape of a T. On the one side, it's coming from Beirut. On the other side, it's coming from Damascus. And on the bottom, it's coming from our area. And what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to reach this Meshulash, take a position on the road exactly at the place where, if the Syrians would send troops into Lebanon, they would stop them. Very intelligent thing to do. In other words, you prevent the problem before it happens, right? You don't want the Syrians to join into the whole brouhaha, into the war, so you stop them before they can enter the area. There was only one problem. They didn't get enough intelligence before they did this. There was a takala, there was a problem with the modi'in, with the intelligence, and the Syrians got there first. And as Gdud 362 of the Armored Corps is going up this road in the east part of Lebanon, through the Bik'ah, they're rolling along on the 11th of June, 1962, during the day, and they reach the area, and night falls, and all of a sudden, hell breaks out. There's no other word for it. The Syrians had taken positions on the hills around a place called Sultan Yaakov, and they see these Israeli tanks rolling down the road. They waited until they were completely engaged into the road, and they opened fire. And throughout the day, the night, throughout that night, much has been written about it, more will be written. There was a terrible, terrible battle there. And in the morning, the word came to pull out, because they realized that they had made a mistake. So they're pulling out, but there's a problem. I mean, you think you can figure it out logically. You have one road, and you have tanks, and they're not like bicycles. You don't just pick them up and throw it to the side in order to get through. You have all these tanks that had been hit, and they're strewn on the road, so they have to go around tanks that are out of action. And what happened was that Zach's tank went off the road. It was hit then, direct hit, and the soldiers who were in that tank had to evacuate. Out, now, leave, because a tank which has a direct hit can go up in flames. The first thing you have to do when you have a direct hit is just get out of there. So they got out, and they are in Lebanese pastoral fields with cherry blossoming trees. It's the spring, and they find a wall to hide behind. And they thought they were hiding behind something. They didn't realize that there was also something in front of them. And this Syrian tank bombarded them. And we don't know, it's like in a movie where all of a sudden there's a blackout and the screen goes black and you don't know what's going on anymore. Because from that point on, we didn't know what happened. We didn't know. So what happened was that I'm sitting in the living room of my parents' house in Beit Vegan, Yerushalayim, on Friday, the 12th or 13th. You'll excuse me if I'm a little hazy with the dates here because it turns into a blur. And we get what's known as the famous knock on the door. And since I'm the youngest person around, I get to answer the door. And I open the door, and who's standing there in front of me? The infamous trio, which every Israeli knows is the trio of human beings, of Jews that you never want to see in your life, because they are from the army. One is a doctor, one is an officer, and the third one is a psychologist. And they are there to tell you something that you never want to hear. So I open the door, and I see them there, and they ask me if my parents are home. So I said yes, and I brought them in, and then they said their piece. We have to tell you that your son is missing in action. and I will draw a veil over the events of the next hour or two. But I can tell you that from that moment on, all of our lives changed. All of our lives changed. I don't remember how we got through the Shabbat, but after Shabbat, we get a telephone call that we're invited to come meet the Rosh Memshalah, and then we had an invitation to go see the Sar HaBitachon, to see the defense minister. We went to see at the time it was Menachem Begin, so we went to Begin's office, and he gathered up all the parents of the soldiers who were missing in action from Krav Sultan Yaakov, and there were a few. Today we know about Tzvi Feldman, we know Yehuda Katz, who have not returned yet, and Zechariah. They were the last three, but there were others at the time. Chezi Shai's wife, Iris, who's a dear friend, she was there, and Dvorah Lifshitz and her husband, the parents of Zohar, they were there. Because in the beginning, anyone who didn't come back from Krav Sultan Yaakov was announced as Nedarim. And this is a tofa'ah, this is a phenomenon that after a battle, you don't always know what's happening. There's an expression in English, war is chaos. I mean, one of the most difficult elements to deal with in battle, and this I'm told secondhand, but I experienced it through my experience, that it's not like according to the book. Everything is different. And there's always a new challenge, and there's all the experience of being at war and not knowing if you're going to live through it, and how do you live with this? And this chaos, the chaos lasted for several weeks, and they were trying to sort the whole thing out because nobody knew exactly what had happened. There were different reports, and months later, a year later, 2 years later, I think it took about 2.5 years to sort it out. Chezi Shai came back from being a prisoner with Ahmed Jubril. The terrorists captured him. And he was Zach's mefaked tank. When he came back from captivity, he was able to tell a story, and I'll share that story with you because we didn't hear it until like 2.5 years later. There was another soldier who came back again, and there were soldiers who came back in our Herzl, right? You have to understand this is a very mixed bag kind of situation. But the story that we heard from Chezi Shai is as follows. He said that when they jumped out of the tank, they went to this fence, and they were trying to find a place. It was an open field, and you know, how do you hide in an open field? You find anything, a rock, something, a protrusion somewhere that you can hide behind. So they found this like fence that was, I don't know, 80 centimeters, a meter high, made out of stones in the field. And they sat with their backs lined up against this fence. And the bombardment continued. And at a certain point, Chezi said that he slipped away because he decided that he wasn't going to sit there and be a sitting duck, but that the others who were sitting with him, that Zach had obviously taken some sort of a pgi'ah, something had hit him, he wasn't able to get up. And he decided to save himself instead of to stay there until they were all dead. So he managed to get away. And Zach was lying there. He was not answering. He called his name, Zechariah, Zechariah, and he didn't answer. And he saw that he was wounded from someplace. And he left him there, and he doesn't know what happened. And this is the story that we lived with from the third year on. Until then, we didn't know anything. And here, we did Sefer Breshit and Sefer Shemot. Now we're going to talk about that mirvach, you know, those 38 years when you don't know anything. What happens when you don't know anything? So from that time on, and even before that, my parents used all their international contacts, their English language, their American citizenship, friendships, and they started to travel all around the world to try to find information. There was a story that they sort of linked onto, and that was that the day after this particular battle, there was a parade in Damascus of Israeli tanks. The Syrians were crowing over Israel, what else is new? And they wanted to show their booty, and they took an Israeli tank that was out of action, and they put people on it. And they thought that perhaps some of those people who were sitting on the tank, maybe one of them was my brother. They wished it was so. Maybe that someone had picked him up and they were parading him in Damascus. This parade in Damascus became a very, very central focus for their hopes, for their investigations, and there were foreign reporters there at the time who reported on this parade. And they tried to get in contact with them. They tried to get in touch with them. They tried to get information from them. And they tried to talk to, also, they tried to use all sorts of connections to find out maybe somebody saw something. And therefore, the next years, they started traveling all over the world. They went to London. They went to Paris. They went to New York. I was in New York. I went to the Red Cross. And when that didn't work, we didn't get any further than we were before. So then they tried a different tactic. They tried to work through the terrorist organizations. And my father, alav shalom, sat down with Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal. And he asked him all sorts of shaylas. How far could he go if he goes to meet? He wanted to go to Tunis. Tunis is the place where at the time the PLO had their headquarters. Arafat, you know Arafat, right? So his headquarters was in Tunis, and my father said, I'm going to go to Tunis. I'm going to start talking to all sorts of terrorist organizations, people. And he wanted mashanikra l'nagev humus. In the Arab world, if you don't sit and eat with someone, you're not their friend. So you have to, you know, sort of like play the game. So he wanted to go and sit with these Arabs of all sorts of terrorists and maybe offer them money, maybe use connections that Israel had and do a swap of some sort. He was in with the Mossad, with the Shabak, with the Israeli intelligence services, and they were working with him. He said, you want to go? Okay, this is what you do. And he would get instructions, and because he had American citizenship, and he felt that as a civilian, he could go further than someone who represents the state of Israel. And so he went to Tunis, and he gave hummus. And when he came back, I remember he got off the plane and he got home from Tunis. And he told me at the first time I saw him after he got back from Tunis, he said, after I left the table and I talked to this terrorist, as soon as the guy left, I had to shake his hand. I said, I rushed to the bathroom to wash my hands because I felt like I had touched the hand of someone who had blood on his hands. He was a terrorist. But he said because it was for the love of his son. He would do anything that was moral, that was correct. But he would go to any length to find out what happened to his son, to bring him back. And during these years, an organization was formed to help him. Good people from all over the country joined forces to help my parents. Amuta leman hashvuim v'hanehdarim. And they would do certain things, and my parents would do certain things. And we're talking about a period of about 30 years, wait, you'll hear what happens next. What was I doing during those years? Well, I hate to tell you, but I copped out. What did I do? After the first 2 years, when I got tired of shaking the hands, the Hesder, of Menachem Begin and Shamir and whoever, I went to visit a teacher of mine. And she told me that I'm going to have to do something very difficult. She said that my parents didn't have the energy to see me as an individual. I was 23 at the time, and I was not married. And if I would continue hanging around the kiryah, my parents would lose the next generation also through me. And I was going to have to do something very, very difficult. I was going to have to stop going to the meetings, stop being involved with the chipus, with the search, and continue my social life and get married and have a family. Because they're not going to give me permission to leave. They're too involved emotionally. And I don't know how God gave me the seichel to follow her advice, but I did. And I dropped out. And a few months later, I met my beloved husband, who also was a student here in the Gush. And we got married. And after the children were born, it turned out to be such a blessing because my parents would come back from wherever they were traveling throughout the world, and they had a home to come back to. Whenever times were tough, it was no question what they would do. They would leave everything, and they would sit in my living room and play with the children. And we had like a weekly, we would go out once a week, and we would get a little this and a little that for the kids, and we would have all the chagim together. We became such a unit, but we had a differentiation within the unit. We had different roles. I was in charge of the simcha. That was nachis. That was my job. I was a nachis giver. And they continued the search for Zechariah. Of course, I heard everything. I knew what was going on. I asked questions. But I wasn't totally involved. I continued a normal life. I worked. I had a family. I raised the family. They got married. Now I have grandchildren, Baruch Hashem. And it gave a lot of strength to the unit because it was the best thing possible. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't. There would have been a double loss. But this way the family continued. And my father, Alav Shalom, used to say that when he's with my children, he forgets everything. I mean, how do you live through 37 years of not knowing unless you have some place to come to and be whole? So this was their wholeness. We would go to them, they would come to us. It was an island of strength and joy in a life of difficulty. Okay, let's go to the end of the story, Sefer Dvarim. 37 years later. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine living like this for 37 years. There's obviously a lot of nuance there. But 37 years later, I get a second knock on the door. Not many families in Israel have had to knock twice. I was at work. I came home. I'm a teacher, high school teacher, English. And I had just come home from work, and I all of a sudden I hear a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. And I go to the door to open, and I see a sea of green from my door, literally out of the house. There must have been 15, we live on the second floor. There must have been about 15, 20 army people there. And look, I'm used to having army people around me. I'm not a person who doesn't see green. I mean, we lived it, and we had regular visits from the army, and we had our people who were in charge of us, and we could always go see someone if I wanted to talk to this person or that person. I got an appointment, and my mother got an appointment. My father got an appointment. We were used to this. I never saw anything like this. This was like a sea of green. There were so many people there, and they said, "Can we come in?" I said, "Okay." So they come into our living room, and they say, "Sit down." And I sat down, and they said, "One sentence. We found your brother in the cemetery in Damascus. We brought him back to Israel, and tomorrow we're going to bury him. And tonight you have to go and see Bibi." Somebody, the family representative, has to go before the press, go before the country. We'll tell you what to do. I'm telling this in a very, very shortened form. They wanted me to first come to my mother, my father had passed away 9 years previously. That's what I meant, 30 years, because there was something. And my mother was still alive at the time, and they said, "Go get dressed, and we're going over to your mother because she doesn't know yet, and we want you there when we tell her." And from that moment, for the next few days, they told me what to do every minute of my life. So we went over to my mother, they told her, and we made plans for the funeral, and then I spoke to Bibi on the phone, and he said, "I want you to come down to the Lishkat Rosh HaMemshala. We're going to have a press conference where I'm going to talk to you, etc., etc." And I don't know if you have ever had a situation in your life. Am I boring you? I don't know if you've ever had a situation in your life where you feel like you're in something which is bigger than you. That's gadol alecha. We say it in Hebrew, the gadol alai. It's something which is, nothing in your life before that prepared you for it, or maybe yes, but the whole situation is so, the only thing I could do during those minutes was to switch from personal mode to Tanakh mode. I don't know, I'll explain to you what I mean. I couldn't explain what was going on to myself in any way in relation. I was in shock, really. So all I did was I thought of psukim in which people were doing things just like me. Now, I don't want to make a chidon Tanakh here, but there are two situations that I remember. Maybe you remember more. But there are two situations in the Bible where people were called to come before the head of state pronto. The first one was Joseph, who was my companion through the 37 years in my head anyway, because the story of Joseph was our story and his story was our story. I mean, we lived Joseph. I lived with the psukim of Joseph through the whole time. And the second one, Lehavdil, was Haman. Now, I hoped I'm not Haman, so I'll go with Joseph, okay? So I'll go with Joseph. But, Vayavhilu, that's the word. Vayavhilu. Vayavhilu. That was I was thinking about these psukim. I was thinking that, I'm Queen Esther, and I have to go before the king, because I wasn't myself. I couldn't cope with the emotions and the whatever was going on. So I'm going to a Achashverosh. I don't know. I'm going to a king. They're taking me. I was like a marionette where you're hung up by the strings of your belief and your culture. My culture is the culture of Tanakh. I was playing a role. That's the way I felt. There's no other way to explain what I did for the next 36 hours. And I was called before the king. And we went before the king. Took my son with me. And I sat with Bibi. And he told me about how they got him back. And he told me that he told me the story. And here's the story. How did he come back? That's what we're waiting for, right? The big punchline. How did he come back? And the story goes like this, and it's a very logical story when you think about it diplomatically. I learned a little bit about diplomacy throughout the years. The terrorists in Lebanon had picked up my brother's body. He was dead. And they did the kindest thing that they could think of. They embalmed him. They put him in a box, which explains a lot of things that happened later. He was preserved. And they buried him in a cemetery that belonged to Plitim, what is it? Refugees. There was a refugee cemetery right outside of Damascus. And they buried him there and they left it. And this is like unbelievable, right? It was psychological warfare. I was the enemy, the family. They were fighting against me, these terrorists, against my parents. They wanted us to go nuts, not know what happened. So they just put him in a box and buried him, and they didn't tell the world. What are you doing? There's a Geneva Convention. You're supposed to do certain things. They're not human beings. They don't do what they're supposed to do. It doesn't exist Geneva Conventions for them. So they left him there. Now, we have intelligence forces who managed to find out where he was. And they found out that he was buried in this refugee camp. And how they found out, they made me promise not to tell, okay? I'm sworn to secrecy over certain things because maybe we'll get back the other two also who are still missing in action. I don't want to tell what happened because I don't want to disturb it. Maybe B'ezrat Hashem, they should bring Yudah back, they should bring Tzvika back. I feel like they're my brothers because we've been together and they're sisters who are my ages. We're three sisters of the three brothers. Anyway, now at that time, ISIS was at war with the Syrians, with whatever, and the Russians were there in this refugee camp. And diplomatic relations, the Russians got him out for us. Unbelievable. This is a story from, I don't know. The Russians got him out. The Russians, according to the instructions from the Shabak and the Mossad and everybody, they told them where to dig, and they got him out. They brought him out, and they're Russians, so they bring him to Russia, and then they fly the casket to Israel, and they bring the casket to Abu Kabir Forensic Institute. They open the casket, and they see a sarbal, an overall. You know, in the tanks you have to wear an overall so it doesn't get caught on something. An overall, they see an overall, and it says on it, Tzahal. And they open the overall, and they find tzitzis, preserved for 37 years. And they said, oh, this is one of ours. And they saw the shoes, it was taken tzvei shel Tzahal. And then they took DNA, and my parents had given DNA, and I had given DNA. We all gave DNA, and it was a perfect match. And I saw the results, and that's when we got the notification. So after Vayavhilu, and after I heard this directly, they told me that Bibi said to me, I want you to come with me to Russia. Because one of the conditions that the Russians had was that they want to have some sort of a ceremony in Moscow. And I want you to accompany me to the ceremony. And then tomorrow at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock, remember whatever hour it was, we're going to be in Har Herzl, and there we'll have our tekes. We're going to have our, we'll bury your brother. So I was very apologetic, and I said to Bibi, you know, if you want me tomorrow at 2 o'clock in Har Herzl, I don't think I can go to Moscow tonight. I mean, it was too much is too much. So he was understanding. And so I went home, and he went to Moscow. And he flew to Moscow, and they didn't take the Sridei Kodesh with them. They took the sarbal, and they took the shoes. He took it on the airplane with him. And when they got to Moscow, they put it into this gorgeous casket, and they took a picture of Zach. You can go online, and you can see the picture. It is absolutely from somebody's dream. It's like, you wouldn't imagine this Jewish boy from Brooklyn, and you have his picture with all these decorations around it in front of a casket. And then on either side of them, the Mishmar, the Red Army, and there's like this tekes, and it's in Russian, and Bibi's there, and they fold up the Israeli flag, and they hand it to him. It's like fantastic. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like, who would have imagined? And Bibi comes back from Russia. I mean, kol hakavod, he goes to Russia, he comes back. And then the next day, we buried my brother. And I must say that there were a few people there. It was absolutely unbelievable, the dimensions of the, you talk about achdut today, about unity. We had unity. We had Am Yisrael there. We had people from all walks of the country together. And now I'm able to go to Har Herzl, and I was there yesterday. And I put my little stone down on the grave. And it was a joy. And it was sorrowful. It was together. But Zach is home. He came back. And we know what happened. And God is great, because a story like this is not created by man. I talked about being a marionette. I don't believe for an instant that any of this was b'mikreh, any of this was incidental. I think there's, the numbers involved here are biblical. You know, when you read the Tanakh, you say, V'tishkot haaretz 40 shana. You know, the country was at peace for 40 years in Sefer Shoftim. And with Yosef, how many years he was in the Beit HaSohar. You're talking about dimensions of years. You don't hear these numbers in normal civilian life stories. We lived a story that the only way I was able to cope with it as a human being was through the Bible. Everything that we did, everything we went through. And if you're saying the Bible, so then you're saying the same hand that wrote the Bible wrote this story. And do we understand it? I can't say that I understand it. But we lived it. We coped with it day by day. And it's a story for Klal Yisrael. It's not my, I have the zchut to tell the story, but it's really a story of Klal Yisrael. And it's a big zchut to be part of Klal Yisrael and to be part of a story like this. And I hope that his memory should be for a blessing for all of us. He was he was so tamim in his belief, and he was tamim with his army service. He was so dedicated. He was so. That's what gives me a big nechama. It gives me a big source of strength that I know that he was tamim with it, and we are also. And we can live with this. And the other source of strength is what I did. Today I am, my husband and I were the parents of children. I had another grandson born on Friday. Thank you. And we're already in the Dusifrati, right? We already, baseball team we have. The boys can play basketball. We're moving up, you know. And God is good. We don't understand the story, but it's the story that I was given. And there were many blessings along the way too. So thank you for listening to my story. And should we take questions? So take a deep breath. I know you heard something here. And if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer. Yes, what's your name? Yes.
When you first found out that your brother was found, was it a feeling of relief, happiness, sadness that you confirmed that he had died? A mix of all of it?
Okay, thank you for that question. The answer is that I think by the time we got to year 37, we logically understood that he wasn't coming back. You don't hold a soldier in captivity for 37 years. You use him as a pawn. But we wouldn't tell each other that this is what we were thinking. I think there's an expression in the Gemara, liba lepuma logalia. In other words, we weren't admitting it in the mouth. We were just knowing it in the heart. And little by little, we understood. But we wouldn't say it because we wanted to maintain a unified front against the world that they should do something. So we weren't talking it, but we understood by then. And so we weren't shocked. But still, the way it happened was a little shocking. I don't think any human being could have easily absorbed such a thing. I mean, the way they did it to me also is like, really? Okay, you got an answer to your question? Yeah, anyone else? Oh, good. I must have answered all your questions already.